Hi, and thanks once again for joining us for this December 1st, Thursday edition of Alaska Weather. And up first on the hazardous warning graphic, we've got some winter storm warnings going for tonight and Friday. St. Lawrence Island, Bering Strait coast, Shishmaref, Northern Seward Peninsula, and also tonight through tomorrow for the northwest coast, Kotzebue, Kivalina, Red Dog Dock, the Noatak and Kobuk valleys there, Ambler and Noatak, and also for the western Arctic coast. And then winter storm warning out for the northeastern Brooks Range and the eastern Arctic coast for late tonight and through tomorrow and tomorrow night in those areas, with winter weather advisories for the central and eastern Arctic coast and also for the central Seward Peninsula, all for possibly significant snowfall and gusty winds anywhere from 40 to 65 miles per hour, and could be some freezing rain out along the coastal areas there from actually Point Hope, Cape Lisburne, right on down to St. Lawrence Island, as well as Kivalina. And for the other warning area that was really too small to see on that graphic, Valdez high wind warning continues in effect until 9 p.m. this evening, Thursday evening, and that's for possible gusts to 75 miles per hour. And let's see, Valdez has had a peak wind gust today of 69 miles per hour, so pretty close to those values there, 75 miles an hour, and still a chance of that until 9 p.m. Then the gradient should relax enough that the stronger warning level winds should end. And otherwise, on the chart here, you can see moisture sliding southeastward with that system that brought the snow across south central Alaska overnight last night, or actually mostly last evening, moving quite rapidly off to the southeast. Brought some light snow to areas of the Panhandle today, but the bulk of the moisture remaining off the coast. Kind of another batch up there brought 1 or 2 inches of snow to the northern Panhandle in the areas there, with the north winds on the increase there behind that weak disturbance. Already gusting up to about 50 miles an hour, Eldred Rock and Lynn Canal. And those will continue to increase to gale force later tonight and through tomorrow. Otherwise, some moisture there over the eastern Aleutians, really not producing much in the way of precipitation, and a frontal boundary way out there to the west over the Shimia and up into the Russian Far East. High pressure, as you can see, shifting eastward there over the eastern Bering Sea, and that pulling some mid and high level clouds, maybe a little bit of light snow into the western Arctic coastal areas, that mostly in the form of cirrus into the interior there, and some light snow, Tin City carrying some snow, St. Lawrence Island basically dry, no significant precipitation amounts that I could see on the chart when I looked. Actually, the heaviest amounts occurred over the Panhandle of anywhere from a few hundredths of an inch water equivalent to maybe 1 to 2 inches that were translated into a couple inches of snow, say around the Juneau area possibly. Otherwise, dry and cold over the southern interior today with diminishing winds. Kodiak Island, peak wind gust 58 miles per hour last night, already coming down this afternoon, and warm air pushing northward, also bringing those southerly winds up to 37 degrees at Savunga this afternoon, but dry conditions there, enough downsloping, and the moisture really back to the west a little bit more than what I've got shown on the chart here. Snow and blowing snow up over the northwest part of the state. Again, more of the blowing snow, additional snow really hasn't occurred yet, and then that low sliding down off the Queen Charlotte's, and high pressure back in over the interior tonight. The main high center will extend over into the Yukon there, and high will hang back over the Kuskokwim Valley, and that'll keep southern Alaska and the eastern interior basically, will be dry with light winds, lightening up winds. You can see the gradient continues to relax, becoming pretty light for Kodiak late tonight, as well as diminishing winds from the North Gulf Coast. Could still see some gale force gusts out of the Copper River Delta after midnight, but winds on the increase, that high moving into the Yukon, put a little bit of a squeeze on the atmosphere between the high center over the Yukon and that trough down off the central southeast coast, as that main low center continues to track southeastward now, west, well off to the southeast. Otherwise, look for some areas of possible rain over the Aleutians tonight, nothing too terribly heavy. and head of that warm front. But you can see that frontal boundary actually kind of pulls back to the west a little bit tomorrow, and south mild southerly flow. Could be some possible freezing rain out along the coast tomorrow. Probably be mostly from the Bering Strait coast up to the northwest coast. Western Arctic coast could see some mixed precipitation as well, as the main area of snow and blowing snow shifts eastward across the Brooks Range and the eastern North Gulf coast, eastern Arctic coast, and North Slope, and possible areas of blowing snow there over the mid and upper Tanana Valley, especially the hilly countries there north of Fairbanks, and maybe over toward Delta Junction. But light winds, dry conditions south over southern Alaska, including Bristol Bay, the Kuskokwim Delta, with fair amount of sunshine again for the North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island during the sunlit hours of the day, and Panhandle not looking bad. All the moisture now well south of the area. Look for increasing rainfall over the eastern Aleutians and the Pribilofs there. Warm air pushing northward, freezing level 2,000 feet all the way up into the Chukchi Sea tomorrow. And for the following day on Saturday, another organized system, or gets organized, a couple of low centers there, and the more intense one actually near Atka Island. But southerly flow, again, another push of warm, moist air coming northward over the eastern Bering Sea. So rain and snow along the southwest coast, rain and snow St. Lawrence Island, as well as the Seward Peninsula behind that warm front, trending toward mostly rain late in the day. Interior areas, though, could see some light snow at times. The lighter the farther east and northeast you go, with the again, precipitation cutting off, say, of the Alaska Range, so could see some light snow into the Kuskokwim Valley and mid and upper Tanana Valley areas, but dry, but with some varying amounts of clouds over Cook Inlet. Kodiak Island, dry, variably cloudy. North Gulf Coast, mostly clear. Panhandle, mostly clear, with now pretty light winds across the area there, as well as the Copper River Basin. Looking at the lows for tonight, actually, there we go. Lows for tonight, teens to mid-20s over the southeast coast, and still 15 to 20 below for the Copper River Basin. Northern Kuskokwim Valley around 10 below, near 0 to the south, near Sleepmute, Sparravon. 5 to 10 for Bristol Bay, mid-20s Kodiak Island, and areas of the Kenai Peninsula, Manuska, Susitna Valley, call it 5 below, 2, 5 above, but down to 12 for Homer, 22 for Seward. 24 for Valdez. Highs tomorrow near 30 for Valdez, Seward, and Homer. Seldovia, maybe a tad warmer. Definitely warmer for Kodiak, upper 30s there. 20s to near 30 for the Panhandle. And staying below 0 on the Copper River Basin. Mid to upper teens for south central Alaska and the Kuskokwim Valley. Mid-20s for the Bristol Bay area. Lows 15 to 20 for Bristol Bay. 5 to 15 in the Kuskokwim Valley. Mid-20s for Kodiak Island. Single numbers for the lows Saturday morning. Susitna Valley, still could be some areas a little below 0, like Willow area up to Trapper Creek, maybe Talkeetna, more so over the Copper River Basin. Lows 15 to 20 below. Mid-20s there for the North Gulf Coast, Prince William Sound, and in the teens to mid-20s for the lows for the Panhandle. Followed by highs, upper 20s to upper 30s for the southeast coast, above 0 now for the Copper River Basin, 20s for the Kuskokwim Valley, lower 30s for Bristol Bay, lower 40s for Kodiak Island, otherwise in the teens and 20s. And up to the north there, lows below 0, eastern interior, and in the 25 to 30 degree range for the Seward Peninsula, staying above freezing with mild southerly winds for St. Lawrence Island. Followed by highs, pushing 40 there for Savunga and Gamble, otherwise mid-30s for the Seward Peninsula, in the teens off to the east, and above freezing for the central and western Arctic coast, followed by lows in the teens up that way, staying in the 20s, mid-20s for the eastern Arctic coast in some cases, as well as the northwest interior, and 5 to 15 for the eastern interior, north of the Alaska Range. Looking at highs Saturday afternoon, lower to mid-20s for the central and western Arctic coast, near 30 for the eastern Arctic coast, and mid to upper 20s over the central and eastern interior, and the upper teens, though, for the Brooks Range, 30 to 35 for the Seward Peninsula and St. Lawrence Island area, and for the southwest coast tonight, 25 to 32 for the lows, mid-30s for the Pribilofs, upper 30s to lower 40s for the Aleutians and Alaska Peninsula, mostly in the 30s. Highs tomorrow in the 40s for the Alaska Peninsula, Aleutians, Pribilofs, mid-30s for the southwest coast, and low temperatures Saturday morning, upper 20s to lower 30s for the southwest coast, mid-30s in the Pribilofs, otherwise mid-30s western Aleutians, lower 40s to the east.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather. A lot of IFR out over the central eastern Bering Sea, right up to the coastline and to the Alaska Peninsula. And then that extending northward through the Bering Strait, Seward Peninsula, northwest coast, Brooks Range, central and western Brooks Range, most of the Arctic coast and North Slope with improving conditions to marginal VFR to the far east. Areas of IFR mostly due to low clouds, fog type of condition into the Yukon Flats and then down into portions of the Tanana Valley. Also, that same sort of pattern could occur over the Susitna Valley, northern Cook Inlet, Knik Arm areas, low clouds, fog early on, and the central Copper River Basin Valley areas, otherwise good through the Panhandle. And for the afternoon time frame, got some marginal VFR for northern Cook Inlet through the Susitna Valley, areas of Copper River Basin, and then a lot of IFR for the Arctic coast down into the northern Bering Sea. Splits there with one band down across the western Aleutians, another one across the Pribilofs and the eastern Aleutians and the southwest coast. VFR Kodiak Island and the Panhandle, North Gulf Coast areas, Kuskokwim Valley. Then on Saturday, next system spreads IFR into the southwest interior, up to the Kuskokwim Mountains and into Togiak. That extends north into the Selawik and Kobuk valleys, and again an area extending eastward over the north central interior area. Some IFR, eastern North Slope Arctic coast, and then a big swath of IFR down over the western Aleutians, but VFR for the Fox Islands, Alaska Peninsula, Bristol Bay, Kodiak Island, and much of the southeast interior and the Panhandle. Then for Saturday afternoon, mostly marginal VFR east and south of the Alaska Range, especially along the North Gulf Coast, Cook Inlet, Kodiak Island, and the Panhandle, with IFR into the central interior, back to the west to about Kivalina, covering Kotzebue Sound, most of the Kobuk, Koyukuk valleys, and all of the Seward Peninsula, northern Bering Sea, Nunivak Island, Pribilofs down to Adak and Atka, westward to Kiska, all in the IFR zone, and some IFR slipping northward there to the eastern Aleutians and western Alaska Peninsula area. Otherwise pretty good, Kodiak Island and the Panhandle North Gulf Coast. Passes Anatuvik, IFR, trending toward marginal VFR throughout the day. And again, Adigan as well, kind of bouncing between IFR conditions and marginal VFR with a slow trend upward in flying conditions into the afternoon. Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR for the day Friday. Rainy VFR. Windy, good VFR as well. And Isabel, VFR. Mintesta, VFR. Tanita, VFR. Portage VFR and Chilkoot and White VFR. Freezing levels, warm air sliding northward into the Chukchi Sea. You can see 6,000 feet all the way up to about Point Ley in the western Arctic coast, 8,000 feet in over the Alaska Peninsula areas. And for icing, areas of isolated moderate rime over much of the interior from the Tanana Valley north to the Arctic coast, and then sliding back into the Seward Peninsula area in northern Bering Sea, and another band there extending southward between 8,000 and 16,000 feet to the western Aleutian areas. Otherwise, southern Alaska and the southeast Bering Sea, Aleutians, Panhandle, staying pretty much icing free, and just a risk of some icing into the Copper River Basin. Jet stream, high pressure aloft there at 33,000 feet, extending up in toward Kuskokwim Valley, Cook Inlet. 140 knot southwest jet over the northwest Bering Sea, goes north of the Arctic coast, and then northeasterlies 85 to 100 knots across southern Panhandle. 9,000 feet, same pattern, 50 to 75 knots southwest winds coming into the northwest coast. Seward Peninsula turned westerly in the interior, and north-northwest and diminished about 40 knots there for the eastern North Gulf Coast. 3,000-foot winds. West-southwest, 55 knots, north slope to the Arctic coast, northern Seward Peninsula, and about 50-knot westerlies there right over the Yukon Flats. South 40 knots, eastern Aleutians. And taking a look at turbulence, light to isolated moderate chop areas of the Panhandle. Considerable moderate turbulence there for the Alaska Peninsula, eastern Aleutians, St. Lawrence Island, as well as the Seward Peninsula, eastern Norton Sound, up across the Noatak Valley, northwest coast, much of the central and western Brooks Range.
Occultation occultists. I'm Trace. Occultation sounds really creepy, doesn't it? But it's just a fancy way of saying obscured or hidden or blocked. I bring it up because next week, Mars is going to pass behind the moon from our perspective, which is an occultation. This will be visible for all the viewers in the U.S. except those in the south and on the east coast. Y'all have to travel a bit to see it. Hit the darkness around 8 p.m. to let your eyes adjust and look east toward the waning but still mostly full moon. Mars will be the bright red dot getting closer and closer and closer to the moon until it's completely obscured. Don't worry, Mars will emerge on the other side of the moon around an hour later. Occultations are only visible on a small fraction of the Earth because the moon has to be aligned just right. So if you see it, count yourself lucky. Turn around once and spit, cross your fingers, and keep looking up.
Since I was a little boy, I've traveled 40 to 50 miles up that river. I'm a commercial fisherman and a hunter. I hunt and I fish for my food to put on the table, and I love it. I'm Jerry Ivanoff, born and raised in Unalakleet, Alaska. I fear not for myself, but for the future generations. The lack of ice, the lack of snow has an effect on the animals and the fish that we depend on to live.
The Arctic Report Card workshop here in Nome, Alaska has been an opportunity for Indigenous people who are along the Bering Sea coast to share their experiences about the impacts of climate change for our future generations.
The Arctic Report Card is an annually produced peer-reviewed report on the state of the Arctic.
The annual Arctic Report Card says the pace of sea ice decline and surface ocean warming is unprecedented.
U.S. government scientists say there is an unparalleled period of warmth in the Arctic.
This year, for the first time, we are including a chapter on the Indigenous perspective. Specifically, it will be a chapter focused on the changing Bering Sea.
I think observation is very important.
My grandparents, they taught me how to look in the sky and observe the clouds. And they used to call me their weather person.
My father was very aware of the environment and the weather conditions, ice conditions. So he spent a lot of time talking to me about what to look for and what to watch out for.
Scientists will come in, spend a year or two in the Arctic, and then gather a whole bunch of information, then go back. The big advantages that Indigenous people have is that they're there the whole time.
And they've seen significant changes that should have been documented starting 20 or 30 years ago.
For many years, the formula has been to invite one or two Indigenous experts into a room full of scientists to hear what they have to say. At this workshop here in Nome, we are trying to shift that balance in a major way where essentially I'm the only scientist in the room.
And we are good stewards. We never depleted any stocks. We kept our land and our waters clean.
When I was growing up, the Bering Sea would be completely locked up. And now what ice we get is, we call it sikule. That's the young ice that's formed from the bottom of the ocean as slush. It floats up. Now it's thin. It's easy to break up.
We need the ice, and with it diminishing, our walruses are in danger. Even the whales that I depend on are in danger.
We have frequent storm surges, flooding, hotter temperatures, not only in the air but in the water, and it's affecting the well-being of fish, plants, and animals.
With the water being 10 to 15 degrees warmer in the Norton Sound, I caught so many belly-up fish in 2019 I've never caught before. My nets actually were totally stinky.
The biggest change I see recently is the lack of the seabirds, the migratory birds.
As a child, we had more subsistence foods. We didn't have a lot of money, but we had a lot of food, which makes up for everything. We were rich with our foods. Today, I worry about that food disappearing.
We're having to adapt to change our ways of hunting.
It's a whole different world that we're going to have to learn to deal with.
They're seeing now what many of us are starting to see or will be seeing soon, and the longer we ignore these kinds of stories and these kinds of examples of what's in store for us, the worse things are going to be.
It is critically important for Indigenous experts from Alaska, like Jerry and Melissa, to come to major scientific meetings, like the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco, to share their observations about the warming Arctic.
10 years ago, our sea ice was about 20 miles outside of our communities, and now it's at minimum 50 miles out. It's just up to us to continue to adapt and not just stay stagnant.
I feel very positive that our voices are finally being heard.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back. Coastal water forecasts. Starting out over Lynn Canal there. Pretty windy again tomorrow, or windier. North sustained 35 knots, gusts 50 knots. Gale warnings also for Stevens Passage. Northeast winds 40 knots, seas 7 feet. And for Clarence Strait, north winds 25 to 45 knots. For the south coast, northeast winds 25 to 30 knots. And the north coast, east-northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. Moving on to Saturday. Lighter winds there, especially for the north coast, turning west-northwest 15 to 20 knots throughout the day, 6 to 8 foot seas. And for the south coast, north to northwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Clarence Strait winds northwest at 15, seas 3 feet. Central northern inside channels, north winds 20 knots, seas 4 feet. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 10 knots for the day Friday, with seas down to 2 feet. Variable winds, light variable winds for northern Cook Inlet. But southern Cook Inlet northeast at 15, Kamishak Bay north at 15, Barren Islands west-northwest winds 20 knots, and for the western North Gulf Coast, light variable winds, but the eastern North Gulf Coast north at 20 with still some outflow wind gusts, Copper River Delta up to 35 knots. Then for Saturday, light variable winds for Prince William Sound and the North Gulf Coast. Westerlies 15 to 20 knots, west 20 for the Barren Islands. Southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, north to northwest winds at 15 knots and a north breeze at 10 knots for northern Cook Inlet with seas at around 3 feet. Moving over to or down to Kodiak Island, variable to north winds for the day Friday at 10 to 15 knots. And from Sitkinak to Castle Cape, winds will be variable at 10 knots with 5 to 6 foot seas. Bering Sea side of the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 15 knots. And for Bristol Bay, winds will be out of the northeast only at 15 knots, seas around 3 feet. First day of the weekend, Kodiak Island, southwest winds 20 to 25 knots. Gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. And gale warnings also for Bristol Bay. Winds east 35 knots, seas at 7 feet. Now for the Aleutians, eastern Aleutians, southeast winds at 20 knots with seas running 4 to 8 feet. Central Aleutians, light variable winds, 10 knots or so, 5 to 8 foot seas. And for the western Aleutians, north winds at 20 knots, seas around 10 feet. And then gale warnings for the western Aleutians on Saturday, west-northwest winds at 40 knots, seas up over 20 feet. Central Aleutians, south winds at 40 knots. And gale warnings also for the Fox Islands, southeast winds 30 to 40 knots with 12 to 16 foot seas. And for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, Friday, southeast winds 20 knots. Yukon Delta Coast, Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, south winds 25 knots. Southwest 25 for St. Matthew Island, St. Paul and St. George Islands, southeast at 15. Then good gales come into the Pribilofs on Saturday. Southeast winds 40 knots, also southeast at 40 for St. Matthew Island, and southeast 40 for the southwest coast, with seas 13 to 14 feet. St. Lawrence Island, south winds at 30 knots, and for Norton Sound, south winds 20 knots. Up along the eastern Beaufort Sea coast for Friday, some brisk wind advisories. West winds 25 knots. Brisk wind advisories also for the central coast. Southwest at 30 knots. Small craft advisories for the western Arctic coast. Southwest 30 knots. And gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea. South at 35 knots. Seas up around 10 feet. Lighter winds and out of the east on Saturday for the southeastern Chukchi Sea. 20 knots. Western Arctic coast, easterlies 15 to 20 knots. And for the central coast, brisk wind advisories. Northwest winds at 30 knots. And gale force westerlies for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west 35 to 40 knots. For tonight, front there and low pressure, along with the high pressure over the southern interior, produces pretty good gradient, moisture coming northeastward, rain and snow, or freezing rain for the coastal areas, but snow and blowing snow winter storm warnings out for the Brooks Range and Kobuk Valley, Kotzebue, Seward Peninsula, Arctic coast, especially the eastern Arctic coast eventually. Otherwise, dry and cold again over southern Alaska tonight, and kind of windy over the Panhandle, but dry. Areas of rain in the Aleutians tomorrow. Snow and blowing snow, northern half of the state. Continued fair with light winds, southern part of the state and the Panhandle. And then on Saturday, another storm winds up out in the Bering Sea with more wind and rain and snow for the southwest coastal areas.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.